baboon. Him and his dancers, yelling have no regrets. I do it for the love, the rush, the buzz, the hush. Whatever turns my knees so much to hit the lift. Even if you gotta sift through the shit to get to the twist. The smile high like it's your last line, but you never get another try. Do it right, do it for the ride, for the heat.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a fascinating story from a friend of mine who I've been friends with for about 20 years. I met this gentleman shortly after I had my encounter in 2006. His encounter happened a few years before that, and it may involve the same juvenile Bigfoot that I saw in my campsite. Here is the spot in the park where this gentleman says this juvenile, 3.5 foot tall at the time, took a candy bar from his hand. All right, so here is a picture of me and Charles standing on Guy Sandy Creek back in the day. And you can see that I've got his face blurred out, and Charles is actually not his real name. Charles is just the name that I'm going to give him because he is a very, very private individual and wants to stay private. He has his job to consider, his people that he knows, relatives to consider. So I'm going to tell his story the way it was told to me. Charles and I met shortly after my encounter there at the park, and little did I know that his encounter involved a juvenile that may have very well been the same juvenile that I had an experience with. But Charles started by putting in a report from a sighting that he had back in 1996 when he, and it's on the BFRO, Murray County, Oklahoma, on the BFRO site, and it involves him taking his younger brother, who was a high school senior, out to Veterans Lake and to hang out with some friends. And on his way back, he had a sighting from his vehicle as he crossed a low water bridge. Now, if you read the report, you'll see that he came in from Sulphur, the town of Sulphur, on 12th Street, which enters the park there on the north side of this map. And it turns to the east and crosses a concrete creek where you have to, a low water bridge. And he took his brother to where that red X is, out to the Veterans Lake Dam. And then on his way back, where you see the white arrow or the yellow arrow, that's the low water bridge where he had his first visual there in the park. And you will have to go to the BFRO sighting report from Murray County to read that yourself to see what he saw. But we'll just go from there, that after he had his sighting, he knew they were in the park. And the yellow X on the park is where I had my encounter at Rock Creek in 2006. So I believe it was the early 2000s when he had his encounter, but it took a while to develop to the point where a candy bar was taken from his hand. But let's go to the beginning of where it all started. So sometime after Charles had his visual sighting at the Loke Creek crossing there, just northeast of Rock Creek, he went through a tumultuous period in his family life where he broke free and retreated back into the park. Now you can look at this map and you can see pretty vast array of trail systems that goes back in there behind Veterans Lake, all the way to Arbuckle Lake. Miles of trails, and some of them, branch off into very desolate areas, very seldom breached by people. So uh, Charles retreated back into some of these areas with a small tent, a little 2-man tent, and supplies, and pretty much went off grid for a while. And he would stay out there for days at a time, maybe even weeks at a time, in his early 20s. And so you can just imagine, uh, I know these creatures are there. So they knew he was there. And how long did it take for them to, get to know him in a way where almost like an acclimation, to him, or getting used to him? But he said that he knew, of course he had his sighting, but he knew when they were around. And he said, sometimes he could tell when they were following him. He would say that he got to where he would carry a bag of small M&Ms, small Snickers candy bars, and he got to where he would leave those out on the trails as he walked. And the specific part of leaving out these small Snickers candy bars is he said that he would open the package and squeeze them out onto the fork of a small branch hanging out over the, where he'd walk, knowing that he was being followed. And he would never touch the chocolate with his own fingers. So he squeezed it out of the package, out of the wrapper, right onto the fork of a branch, and then would just keep on walking. So that became a pattern where he was being followed, and he would leave these little sugary chocolate treats. So that clearly became the main catalyst to why he was being followed. He did not know at the time that he was courting a youngster. He just thought, the only one that he had ever seen was in the vehicle, which was the large male, or what could have been a male. So he would just assume that, he was leaving a treat for, a larger one. Didn't know until it culminated into the event that we're getting to, that the treats were probably going to a little one. So there you have it. He would say that there were times where he would always be aware of when he was being followed. And all of you out there who have had encounters, where you're paced out of the woods or followed, you kind of know that feeling where you can hear things behind you, and they stop when you stop, they walk when you walk. So the patterns all seem to be the same. So the same thing with Charles. He said specifically he would cross an opening, in the wood. There would be an opening that he would cross, and when he would keep on walking, he would take notice to listen carefully. And it's like they would pause, give him a little chance to get further distance, and then he would hear them rush across the openings to get to the other side. No matter how big the openings were, there was a cadence where they would pick up their step to cross the opening to get back into cover. Cover was that important to them. Now remember, back in the park in this time, there was a lot of thick cover, a lot of cedar trees, uh, and a lot of the paved roads that are there now were gravel. So it was a different state of how the park looked back then, as opposed to the way it does now. When I pull the map up and look at it now, uh, it was much more rugged with gravel roads, probably more overhanging trees, and a lot thick cedars, which is great cover for something moving through forest trying to stay hidden. So, I certainly believe that since they've cleared all those things out of the park, that has hampered the activity there. I don't think it's come to a dead stop, but I do think it has slowed it down, when you remove their cover. So that was what Charles was dealing with. He knew he was being followed. He was leaving them treats, and he had other sightings at the park. There at Veterans Lake, looking off to the east from Veterans Lake. He told me a story where he watched a young one running through that field and jumping into the arms of an adult one night. So there are quite a few incidents of happenings, around that park. Certainly my own. In this map, you can see that the yellow X at the top, that's where my encounter happened. And then the X to the left of Veterans Lake, that is where the candy bar was taken from Charles' hand. Uh, so there's plenty of other things going on in the park. Before and after that, you have Charles Hallmark, the Dr. Charles Hallmark, who had all of his encounters at the park, which I think was directly related to me having my encounter, with the trash can baitings and the fingerprints that he was collecting. So you certainly can do a lot of homework about the encounters there in the park. You can look up anything you can on Dr. Charles Hallmark. You certainly can watch the video of my encounter there to get a lot of information. Now, my friend Keith, he had encounters at the campsite that involved a young juvenile. I had an encounter that involved a young juvenile, even though the juvenile from my encounter was about 5.5 feet tall. Now, I'm just guessing 5.5 feet tall compared to the big one. I mean, it could have been 6 foot tall. It just looked so short compared to how big that big one was. I could be off by as much as 6 inches. I mean, it could have been a 6 footer and still look small compared to that big male. So, a few years prior to that is when Charles had his encounter, which involved, he said it was about 3.5 foot tall. So it could be the same one. It sounds like it probably is the same one, especially since my friend Keith, in the park had seen it and, saw it jump the road. So, yeah, you got to keep that in mind that all of these, what are the odds that two or three different encounters from different people that, that didn't know each other. I mean, Keith and I knew each other, but to have a sighting that involved a youngster be such a prominent player in the encounter, what are the odds? I mean, if I was to gather up reports from people and they just talk about seeing a Bigfoot, if they were all made up, how would they get that one component to be a part of it, unbeknownst to each other? So the fact that I had a young one involved in my encounter, Keith had one in his encounter, and then Charles had his previous to mine had his own encounter that involved a 3.5 foot tall one. So let's go to the location, and the location is he had come in on the east side of Veterans Lake and walked down through an area. As you can see, there's the spillway coming off the dam, and you just enter the woods in there. And so he'd come down through the woods and was working his way into that open area. You can see where the yellow X is and the yellow area. That's where he came through those trees, and he could tell that he was being followed at that point. So he came down where that arrow shows, going downhill across that small opening to where the yellow X is. The yellow X is this location right here. When we get to the part of the story where he drops down to the ground, it was in front of that tree right there. Now remember, he was still going through his same pattern of leaving the small candy bars in various nooks and crannies of trees as he would walk. Every 30, 40, 50 yards, he would drop off a small candy bar. So he's working his way down this hill to cross this opening. which would basically get him down there towards the creek. And he stopped at that tree and to have a cigarette, he said. So he looked back from the direction that he came, and when while he was having his cigarette and he was looking up the hill, he saw a head start to break the crest of the hill. And before it got to the eyes, where it was just the top of the head breaking the top of the crest of the hill, Charles dropped to the ground with his back against the tree. So he's sitting motionless with his back to the tree, facing upwards as this Bigfoot crests the hill above him. And he can see that she was looking left and right, looking for him. So she started coming down the hill in a zigzag pattern. And of course, Charles is sitting there kind of dumbfounded of what he's seeing. And there was a young one at her feet coming down with her. So it was a female and a youngster. Clearly, those were the ones that were enjoying the candy bar treats. It probably had been them all along that started the pattern of following him around whenever they see him or find him in the park making his rounds. They would fall into that pattern of being the ones to follow him around. Probably once that youngster got a taste of those chocolate treats, it was probably hard to resist. So they're coming down this hill towards him, and he's frozen against the base of that tree, facing them. He's sitting on the ground facing them, and they're coming down. And when they get to the flat area down there in that field, that's when she sees him. So she sees him for the first time. As she came down the hill, she did not see him. But when she got to the base of the hill and started coming across, that's when she saw him. And instead of going into some type of panic or evasive mode, he said she sat down. So maybe there had been enough of a pattern in place where they knew who he was, maybe knew that he was dangerous, and didn't feel the need to have to run or go get in behind something. So he said she sat down right there in that spot where you see the arrow at the end of the zigzag. So he said she's sitting down facing him, and he can see the bottom of her feet. And he said that he noticed that one of her feet was damaged, maimed, like maybe it got caught in a trap, like a bear trap or something. He couldn't tell, but he could just tell that one of the feet were damaged. And so you've got this youngster that is focused in on him too at this point. The mom has sat down, and the youngster focused in on Charles. Now, here's where it really gets interesting. He said the youngster was kind of playing around and going left to right out in front of the mother and back to her. But he could see that throughout these motions of activity, he was getting closer and closer. And the little one kept looking back at the mom. So he would move a little bit, try to pretend like he's just playing and frolicking around, but he was increasingly getting closer and closer to the location of Charles. And he kept looking back at mom like he was looking for instructions or looking for an emergency or distress signal from mom, or some type of signal from mom that he did not get. She just remained calm, sitting there, allowing him, the youngster, to do what he was doing, giving him the freedom to exercise his own caution. That's what it seemed like to Charles. Charles reached in his bag for one of the candy bars and held his hand out. And so the little one is going back and forth, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, kind of a dance of increasingly getting closer and closer, very nervously, but still you could tell it was its main motivation was the candy bar. It had plenty of experience with these candy bars, knowing what they tasted like, and that's what it was there for. And so it got closer and closer to him. And when Charles said that it was about maybe 15 feet away, it lunged towards him. And he said it went to all fours and pounced towards him and snatched the candy bar from his hand. But he said the G forces of his body actually hit Charles because it it couldn't just stop in midair. So it snatched the candy bar and then its body hit. And he just said it just knocked the wind out of him. He said it was quite powerful. Even for like a 3 foot tall juvenile, the power behind it snatching the candy bar and its body hitting his, bouncing off of him, and it scampered back and nestled right in between the legs of the mother, sitting there with the candy bar. Now, at this point, it's got the candy bar in its hand, but it had never had to take the chocolate out of a package himself. They had always been squeezed out. The chocolate has always been squeezed out uh, of the package by Charles. But this time it had the package itself in his hands. And he said that he could see that it took him a long time to get it figured out, toying with it, tearing at it, until he got it opened up and got the candy bar eaten out of it. And there was some amount of time that it was interested in the package itself and was looking at the package and playing with the package. And then it got to the point where it looked back across at Charles and started the same procedure of dancing around, looking back at mom, making sure that mom was okay with this. And as he was doing that dance, again, moving back and forth, frolicking to get closer and closer, obviously to get another candy bar. And Charles said that he reached into his pocket and went into a little bit of a panic because he said the bag was empty. That the candy bar that he held out in his hand the first time was the last candy bar in the bag. So he said he was kind of a bit in a panic and didn't know what to do. And so he said he remembered watching a show about chimpanzees and how they would reach out to a chimpanzee, say, like from another troop, and make contact by touching knuckles or touching hands or something to that effect. So he said he didn't know what else to do and he didn't have a candy bar. So he had his closed fist that he just held out there into the air. And he said it took the juvenile quite a long time to do his dance, to get closer and closer and closer. And maybe at some point it saw that Charles did not have a candy bar in his open hand, but it continued the process anyways and got closer and closer. And he said, again, when it was about 10 foot out, it kind of crouched down and jumped forward. And he said it had its own fist and knuckled, the hit his fist with his knuckles, and then ran back to the mom. So I did some snooping around online about chimpanzees and behaviors using their hands for touch and communication and things like that. So you can either freeze this and read it yourself, or you can get online and look up for yourself. But there are a lot of different variations of how they would use their hands to touch and communicate and things like that amongst themselves. Now, chimpanzees, I'm sure, are different, but the reason I'm using chimpanzees as my pictures and examples is because a lot of people describe young juvenile Bigfoots especially ones that they see in the trees, of being very chimp-like in their in how they look. So it doesn't mean that they behave like chimps, but they look like chimps. And so I would think that some of the behaviors may be similar, maybe not exact, but uh, but, but yes. So it did touch Charles with its knuckle and then ran back to the mom. Charles said that he sat there and watched them work their way back up that hill, to the top of that hill. And he said the most amazing thing, when they got up to the top of the hill, as he was watching them, there was a large chocolate male standing there at the crest of the hill that had been watching the whole thing, that Charles never saw because he was focusing his attention on the little one and the female. And all he could tell me was, my God, Randy, what if I would have tried to grab that little one when it came up to me to get the candy bar? There was a large male up on the top of this hill watching this whole thing take place. The large male allowed it to happen. The female allowed it to happen. They gave a little bit of freedom to the little one to exercise decision making abilities, or maybe they enjoyed the candy bars too. I don't know. But just the fact that there was a large male up there while this was taking place certainly adds a dynamic to this story that is a bit terrifying. That if he would have tried to say split decision of the moment to grab that little one for whatever reason, can you imagine? He probably wouldn't have survived. I just want to say that I appreciate Charles and his friendship over the last couple of decades. I find what happened to him very valuable because it corroborates what happened to me. It fits the same timeline of that youngster, uh, from year to year, the age, the way it should have been. So I believe it 100%. I believe it happened the way he said. And there's patterns to be followed with how he established this to happen, in the way that he would move through the forest there and leave the treats the way that he did. He was aware that they were there. He was aware that they were following him, but he didn't do anything more than just get them used to him. And maybe he just kind of acknowledged that he knew they were there, and established a pattern of behavior that they could live with. And clearly, it turned into something spectacular. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. I know I did, and I do. Uh, and hopefully, there's more to come from that park, because I know they're still there. So, thank you.
For the heat